Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
FEMA's future is uncertain. Legal fights, funding cuts, and reform debates are piling up. But what should change and what should stay? In a wide-ranging conversation, federal host Terry Gerton spoke with former FEMA Administrator Brock Long to get his thoughts on the path forward.
I want to start with an interesting question. I think people sometimes say of various federal agencies, if we didn't have it, we'd have to create it. We didn't create FEMA until 1979 with Jimmy Carter, but the Trump administration says we don't need it anymore. You were the former administrator of the agency. What do you think? Do we still need FEMA?
I definitely think that the nation needs some form of emergency management, no doubt. And one of the conversations I wish I could have, Terry, is going back with Jimmy Carter to understand what his original intent of formulating the agency was. And I think if I were going to guess, I think President Carter would say we need a disaster relief agency that helps people on their worst days. But since 1979 all the way up to today, the mission of FEMA has just increased dramatically. And we've gone from a disaster relief agency back in the early 80s all the way to this community long-term recovery agency that I don't think the agency was ever designed to be.
So if we were going to continue it, what should its core mission be?
Well, I think that's a question for Congress as well as the administration, but more importantly for the emergency managers. Let the emergency managers inform Congress and the White House on a holistic reform plan that would work. I do believe in reforming FEMA, but I don't want it to be the way that we've done reform after Hurricane Andrew in 1992 or Hurricane Katrina or, the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. I feel like our previous attempts to reform FEMA have been, I equate it to strapping shiny new parts to a rusty bicycle. And I think that the rusty bicycle needs to be thrown out, and we need to rethink how we set FEMA or some element of a FEMA into place that it can be successful. I think that FEMA has been a victim of mission creep. I think that, because of all these laws and reforms in the past that we've kept strapping new programs, to the agency, and it cannot be good at all of them. It can't be all things in all situations. And again, Terry, emergency management is a team sport. When FEMA has to play the role of 911 and take over a disaster response and recovery on behalf of a governor and local communities, it never goes well. And we've got to make sure that we redesign a system where it truly is locally executed, state managed, and federally supported, and not the other way around.
So one of the core issues there is whether or not states are collectively capable of taking on more responsibility when it comes to disaster response. There's certainly a spectrum. What's your take there?
Again, I'm all for reform, but I think we have to be careful in the way that we do it. I think that what I would like to see is the independent council that was put together to reform FEMA, largely being led by former Governor Bryant of Mississippi. I would like to see their bipartisan effort, what they revealed, the recommendations that they put together, and how that can be utilized by Congress to hit the reset button over time. This is not something where you just delete FEMA and expect the states to be ready to go. We have to time phase meaningful change into place and let the governors absorb what those changes are going to be and allow them time to build budget stability around disaster response, build staffing capability and technical expertise that they may not have. But regardless, reform is good as long as it's holistic, but it's also got to be time phased in over the next 3 years. That's what I think.
One of the key programs that FEMA had to help states was the BRIC program. It was a grant program that incentivized investment in mitigation strategies so that the damage from an emergency was less. The Trump administration has terminated that. Without the BRIC program, how can you incentivize states to make those really challenging kinds of investments in hazard mitigation?
Oddly enough, the BRIC program was something that I successfully advocated for under the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. And one of the things that I started to ask the question about while in office in 2017, and if you back up, Terry, when I was in office, if you add up all of the disaster recovery funding that is going to go out to fix communities as a result of the 2017-18 disasters, it's more than the 9 previous FEMA administrators before me combined. That is something we have to stop. But one of the reasons that we pushed community lifelines was, in some cases, I think as a nation, we spend too much time trying to figure out all of the risk and vulnerabilities, all of the things that can go wrong. But what we see today with the changing threat landscape from cybersecurity or a ship losing its steering currents and knocking out a bridge, an interstate bridge near Baltimore, so many things are happening that we can never guess it. But what we need to change our focus on, rather than all the things that can go wrong, is, Terry, what's got to be working in our communities that if it's not working, then people are dying or life routine is disrupted. And I think what we would uncover is that 85% of the infrastructure that we generally depend on, energy to communications to private hospital systems, it's owned by the private sector. FEMA doesn't have control on getting your lights back on or making sure that your cell phone works properly. But yet we've come to this point where FEMA becomes the scapegoat and the blame for all things that go wrong in a disaster, and that's got to stop. But more importantly, the importance of the BRIC program was once we uncovered what had to be working, or what we called community lifelines, public safety to farm to table food logistics, how grocery store chains work, or hospital systems, transportation systems, power and fuel. Once we identify those important things, we better be focused on how we're going to mitigate those things, whether they're public or privately owned, so that they never go down. And when they do go down, it's for a short period of time. And I would like to see an adult conversation being had in DC with local and state leaders on, we better get our act together and we better formulate a BRIC 2.0, which I have heard is in the works.
I'm speaking with Brock Long. He's the executive chairman of Haggerty Consulting and the former administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Well, thinking about those federal lifelines, the federal disaster response system is so complicated. It involves so many agencies, so many different levels of government, private sector, nonprofit sector. How can that process be simplified so that hurting people in the middle of a disaster get the support they need?
Terry, great question. Again, when I was in office, I had to ask Congress 3 times in 2 years to provide more funding into the disaster relief fund to pay for these disasters that were taking place. 1, that's a very negative cycle. But 2, Congress listened and they granted the funding each time I asked, but the money went to 30 different federal government agencies to fund 91 different recovery programs. So, Terry, if you were the governor of whatever state, when a major disaster occurs, a multi-billion-dollar disaster occurs in your front page news, all of these programs that are potentially made available to you, it's hard to interpret, it's hard to understand what you're entitled to, it's hard to sequence those programs together to ultimately do the greatest good and not only respond and recover, but become more resilient. So as the restructure of FEMA takes place and the reform of whatever the emergency management element is going to be, we've got to get it down to one massive block grant that allows governors a lot of discretion on how they can use that funding to overcome the unique problems that each disaster presents them. And so we have to put general checks and balances in place to make sure that the governors are passing that money down to the locals to get the job done when disasters strike, and that the money is being utilized to respond, repair, and recover and be more ready in the future. But we also have to empower them. If we're going to put the onus on their shoulders, we have to empower them to make sure that the funding is scalable and zoomable and can fit whatever they face.
Well, we're in the middle of thinking about this restructure of FEMA. That doesn't mean that there's not a disaster that won't happen tomorrow. And FEMA's already lost a lot of its institutional memory through downsizing, and now the Trump administration has terminated its collective bargaining agreements with FEMA. What impact is all of this having on the workforce there if they did have to respond immediately to some kind of disaster?
I definitely think that FEMA is at a point where they have diminished capacity, no doubt. I think, no doubt about that. And it does cause great concern, and I have voiced that concern many times. But if we're going to reform the system, I've often said that emergency management is not only a team sport, but it looks like a chair with 4 legs. If the seat of that chair is the United States or the state that you live in or your community, it's supported by 4 different legs that mean different things. The first leg is a culture of preparedness that exists, within our citizenry. We don't have a true culture of preparedness within our citizenry. A majority of citizens have no idea how to do CPR or invest $1 in the stock market. We say neighbor helping neighbor is very important during disaster, but I'm not so sure that our neighbors have the tangible skills to really help you out when needed. We don't know how to grow food. We don't know how to produce clean water. And we've got to really start some grassroots community emergency response training efforts to bolster the first line of defense, which is you, the citizen. And one of the biggest problems is a lack of insurance or access to insurance or affordability. Insurance is the first line of defense. It's a tough problem to crack. We could spend an hour discussing that right here. But that first leg is a true culture of preparedness within our citizenry. Two, it's a strong state and local government. Anytime California, Florida, Texas, states like that got hit, the disaster went well because the governors take emergency management very seriously, and they built strong, robust state emergency management capability and a network of local emergency managers. When that capability does not exist, governors don't manage and lead their states well in disasters. And that's where you see collapses like what we saw in Katrina, when FEMA was the sole 911 responder into Puerto Rico. It doesn't go well. And we've got to build a solid baseline at the state and local level, coupled with non-governmental organizations active in disasters that can, help them overcome unique problems that government can't. The third leg is the private sector that owns the infrastructure that we depend on. How ready is the private sector? From future cyber attacks to hurricanes to whatever, how resilient is the infrastructure that they're building? We need to be asking these questions. Infrastructure should not be allowed to rot and decay in communities because it makes us more vulnerable, and the power and the lights and water goes off for longer than it should when we do those things. And then the fourth leg is the firepower of the federal government through an agency like FEMA. If you have all four of those legs attached to that chair is pretty stable and the disaster goes well. Remove one, Terry. Remove one, the chair is unstable. Remove two, it doesn't even stand up anymore. You can't even sit in it. And so, trying to provide you a vision of, it's, again, a team sport. We all have to come together. We're all responsible for preparing for and responding to disasters. It cannot be just on a FEMA's shoulders.
That's a great illustration. And so I want to close just by asking you, the first Atlantic hurricane of the season is on its way towards the east coast of the United States as we speak. If you could pick one thing that you would want people to know and do to be prepared for this and in the future, what would it be?
Sit down with your insurance agent and make sure you're properly covered. Terry, the one thing, I don't believe our public awareness campaigns have been remotely successful. We've asked people to go buy supplies for years and years and years, buy 5 days worth of food, do all these things, go get a generator. It's not happening. It's an unrealistic financial ask in many households for various reasons, from income poverty to asset poverty, or it's just not your priority. I have never seen anybody starve to death in this country after a disaster. But what I have seen is tens of thousands of people who are uninsured or underinsured. Make sure you understand your insurance policies and make sure that you're properly covered. And if you can't get coverage, figure out what you can do to find coverage.
Brock Long is the executive chairman of Hagerty Consulting and the former administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, speaking there with Federal Drive host Terry Garton.